Dobrodošli u novo izdanje emisije. Ja sam Azra Hadžić, priče koje izdvajamo. Zašto dvodržavno rješenje Izraela i Palestine nikada nije uspjelo? Kako na izborima namjeravaju glasati Amerikanci arapskog porijekla u ključnoj državi Michigan? Na koji način se Palestinci na okupiranoj zapadnoj obali bore sa ekonomskim teškoćama i ograničenjima koje im je nametnuo Izrael? Desetljećima su svjetski čelnici govorili da je rješenje izraelsko-palestinskog sukoba jednostavno. Dvije države, Izrael i Palestina, jedna pored druge. Ali je li to uopće pravo rješenje i šta mu stoji na putu da se i realizira? Pojašnjeno u priči Al Jazeere Plus.
I've been to the occupied Palestinian territories and reported from there for years. I've spent a lot of time filming stories and documentaries about life under Israeli military occupation in the places that are supposed to make up a future Palestinian state. Palestinians are a people. There's a Palestinian flag. Palestine is represented at the United Nations. But for now, there's no actual Palestinian state. And I think the chance of there being one as part of a two-state solution that divides this land between Israelis and Palestinians, well, I don't think that's very likely. And I'm going to tell you why. More than 140 countries recognize Palestine as a state.
Norway recognizes the state of Palestine.
The path to peace goes through a two-state solution.
We have recognized both the state of Israel and the state of Palestine.
This is where many people expect this state to eventually exist. More than 5.5 million Palestinians live in these territories, many of them refugees expelled from their homes by Israel. Remember that because it's an important part of the story and we'll get to it later. But for now, I want you to pay attention to these.
You know, one thing that stands out to me every time I travel between Palestinian towns in the West Bank is how many Israeli settlements there are. They're everywhere.
You can see these white stone-walled buildings and red-tiled roofs all over the occupied West Bank. And under international law, they are all illegal because this is not Israeli land. But the people who live in these areas are Israeli settlers. In fact, about 1 in every 10 Israeli Jews lives in one of these settlements. They include high-ranking government officials, military commanders, and Israeli Supreme Court justices. The Israeli government subsidizes their lifestyle with cheaper housing and tax breaks. These settlements are built on land confiscated by force from Palestinians. Stolen is another word for it. And the settlements are built between Palestinian towns and villages, cutting people off from each other and from their own natural resources. The infrastructure of these Israeli settlements, security zones, settler roads, and military bases have made it impossible to create a contiguous Palestinian state here.
If you're asking me, is a Palestinian state viable with all these settlements spread out throughout the West Bank? No, it's impossible. It's impossible to have a state. That's the reference to the Swiss cheese with holes.
If the West Bank was going to become part of a Palestinian state, then these holes would have to be filled in by absorbing the settlements into this future Palestine. Either the Israeli settlers would come under Palestinian rule, or they'd have to be removed. It's hard to imagine Israel forcing hundreds of thousands of its citizens out of the settlements it spent decades building for them. In fact, Israel has said that it wants to annex those settlements and keep them for itself. The settlements are the most obvious reasons why Palestinian statehood in the West Bank remains highly unlikely. It's a reason you can see and feel. It's a reason that's literally made of concrete. But there are also a lot of political reasons. Let's go back a few decades. The closest we've ever been to a two-state solution was the 1993 Oslo Accords, a deal signed by the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. The PLO had given up its claims to historic Palestine and hoped the Oslo Accords would lead to a Palestinian state in just the West Bank and Gaza. As part of the Accords, the PLO recognized Israel. Israel did not recognize a Palestinian state in return. The Israeli Prime Minister at the time was the Labour Party's Yitzhak Rabin.
The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been shot. A Jewish gunman attacked him tonight at a peace rally in Tel Aviv.
Rabin's assassin accused him of giving up too much to the Palestinians. But Rabin had never intended to accept full Palestinian independence. He said the most Palestinians would ever get was an entity less than a state. And this has always been the most that any Israeli government has been willing to consider. For example, Rabin was seen as a liberal. But Israel's longest-serving prime minister, the conservative right-wing Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that the most he'd allow Palestinians to have is a state minus. And as we were recording this, the Israeli parliament voted to reject the creation of a Palestinian state. So the rejection of a fully independent Palestinian state is mainstream in Israeli politics. In contrast, even Hamas, the other major Palestinian movement, has said that if a real Palestinian state were to be founded in the West Bank and Gaza, it would accept that. Obviously, the Oslo Accords did not lead to an independent Palestinian state, and there haven't been serious negotiations for a resolution since early 2001. But one thing every Israeli government has done, even when there were negotiations, was to build more settlements. Here's Israeli historian Avi Schleim describing that strategy.
He's like a man who pretends to negotiate over the division of a pizza and he keeps eating it.
Okay. Yeah. I promised that was the last food analogy in this video, but this whole idea of cutting up the land and dividing it is not new. It's actually a pretty old one. So old that there's an argument that partition, trying to create two states on this land, is the cause of this conflict. Let me explain. In 1917, the British Empire occupied Palestine and promised to establish a Jewish homeland there. Now, that was a problem because Palestine was not empty, and only 6% of its population was Jewish. So, over the next 30 years, Britain tried to change those demographics. It encouraged the immigration of European Jews to Palestine and helped them build the infrastructure of a state.
Today, the refugee from Germany finds 350,000 Jews in Palestine. Finds himself one of 50,000 a year pouring in from all over the world. No more than 50,000 because that is the quota Britain has set.
At the same time, it brutally repressed Palestinian resistance to British occupation and put down any attempt by Palestinians to build a state of their own. And Britain created multiple commissions and reports, like this one, to answer the question of how to turn Palestine into a Jewish state. The answer often came back as partition, dividing the land into two countries, one Arab and one Jewish. The two-state solution. But because Palestinians were the majority, this meant that hundreds of thousands of them would have to be expelled to create a state with a sustainable Jewish majority. By the end of World War II, an exhausted Britain was retreating from its global empire and gave up sorting out the problem it had created in Palestine.
The Union Jack was hauled down and the doors closed for good on the British mandate.
It punted the question to the newly created United Nations, which in 1947 voted to partition Palestine and to give 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews were still a minority. The UN plan didn't explain how this state would be Jewish when, even in that territory, Jews weren't a clear majority. So the leaders of what would become Israel began changing those demographics by force. They began expelling the Palestinian population, eventually emptying more than 450 cities, towns, and villages. Israel declared itself a state in May 1948 and defeated a feeble, unorganized military intervention by several poorly equipped Arab armies. By the time the fighting stopped, Israel controlled not just 55%, but 78% of the land. Most importantly, it had driven out 750,000 Palestinians, 3/4 of the population, and has never allowed them to return. Palestinians call this the nikada, the Arabic word for catastrophe. And in 1967, Israel went on to occupy the rest of what had been Palestine. Since then, attempts at creating a two-state solution have focused on reversing what happened in 1967. They ignore what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, when they were displaced and made stateless. Today, there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees, those who were kicked out by Israel and their descendants. If partition was to finally succeed and we end up with two states, where would they go? You might assume they'd all go to the new state of Palestine. But under international law, refugees have the right to return to where their homes were, which would be inside Israel today. So here we are again, trying to square this circle. To become a Jewish state, Israel forced out most of the non-Jews. Letting them back in, which Israel is obligated to do under UN Resolution 194 adopted in 1948, would make Jews a minority again. You know, the refugee issue isn't a minor problem. For Palestinians, the right to return is at the center of their struggle and identity. But even if we were to ignore that and just focus on creating a Palestinian state on the ground, we have to deal with the fact that neither Israel nor its main backer, the United States, really accept the idea of Palestinians having full sovereignty. They insist that a Palestinian state can't have its own military, for example. It's hard to imagine Palestinians accepting that, especially considering what happened during the Nakba or Israel's current destruction of Gaza. Still, let's assume that all those issues were resolved or put to the side. In that scenario, Palestinians would accept a state on 22% of their homeland. That's the West Bank and Gaza. They'd agree to Israel annexing the settlements it has built on that land. Millions of Palestinian refugees would give up their right to return to their homes. Palestine would be made up of disconnected territories, and it would have less sovereignty than any other country on earth. What would a two-state solution mean for Israel? Because Israel's own laws define the country as a place where the right to self-determination is reserved for Jewish Israelis only. As Benjamin Netanyahu once said, Israel is the national state not of all its citizens, but only of the Jewish people. That's a problem when about 20% of your population isn't Jewish. These are Israel's Palestinian citizens, the ones who managed to stay behind during the Nakba. If a separate Palestinian state is established and Israel remains a Jewish state, what would happen to them? Some Israeli officials have been explicit about wanting to expel them to any future Palestinian state, although most Israeli politicians refuse the idea of that state ever existing. So we keep coming back to the same point. Every attempt to partition the land and separate Israeli Jews and Palestinians ends in either population expulsion or a system where people have different rights based on the community they were born into. So to recap, Israel's illegal settlements and land grabs have pretty much made the founding of a Palestinian state impossible. But even if that wasn't the case, just creating a Palestinian state doesn't fix the core issue of this conflict, the forced expulsion of most of the Palestinian population. It also doesn't address the discrimination facing Israel's non-Jewish citizens. The two-state solution doesn't solve any of these problems. What the two-state solution does is try to preserve a Jewish majority state that was only created by forcing the Palestinians out. And to be honest, all of this is based on hopes from decades ago. It doesn't reflect the reality of today, where Israel has destroyed Gaza and effectively annexed the West Bank already. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, like many other human rights groups, describes that reality as apartheid, a system of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. Maybe the solution isn't to find new ways to separate the people on this land by ethnic division, but to strive for equality among all. So all those officials from around the world that talk about a two-state solution, perhaps they should also drive around the occupied West Bank, understand the reality, and then figure out what they'll do to change it.
Ostalo je još mjesec i po do predsjedničkih izbora u SAD-u. Prema gotovo svim relevantnim istraživanjima javnog mnijenja očekuje se napeta izborna utrka, a pitanje pobjednika tradicionalno će se lomiti u nekoliko ključnih država kao što su Pensilvanija i Michigan. Amerikanci arapskog porijekla još raspravljaju kome dati glas. Zajednica je to koja je tradicionalno podržavala demokrate, ali mnogi kažu da ovaj put neće biti tako. John Hendren izvještava iz grada Dearborna u Michiganu.
U zajednici arapskih Amerikanaca, koja je ranije naginjala demokratama, mnogi su ljuti i osjećaju se izdano od predsjednika Bidena i potpredsjednice Harris zbog podrške izraelskom ratu. Posjetili smo ArabCon, nacionalnu konvenciju Amerikanaca arapskog porijekla, gdje se govorilo o genocidu u Gazi i kako bi glasanje te zajednice moglo utjecati na ishod izbora u novembru. Među učesnicima je i gradonačelnik Dearborna, Abdullah Hamud, koji nije podržao kandidatkinju svoje stranke za Bijelu kuću.
This is the place where community comes first and where the people have the gall and the backbone to say people over party and damn it, people over president.
Spisateljica Susan Abulhava kaže da njen glas ide kandidatkinji stranke zelenih Jill Stein, koja je pozvala na prekid rata.
I'm asking you to have enough self-respect to not go and vote for the Democratic Party.
Ljekara Adama Fasa savladale su emocije dok se prisjećao užasa liječenja pacijenata u Gazi. Upozorio je da će čak i oni koji prežive ovaj rat trpjeti dugotrajne posljedice.
The mental health crisis is one of many crises that are coming after this genocide and this war stops. The debilitated patients we talked about, the mental health, the uneducated kids that are growing up now that schools are all shut down.
I Harris i Trump vode jaku kampanju u Michiganu, ali u ovoj ključnoj državi malo je njihovih pristalica unutar ili izvan Arab kona.
You have Trump, who's a fascist, and you have Harris, who led under an administration that directly supported and funded the ongoing genocide.
Mnogi su izrazili bijes jer se njihovim porezima finansira oružje kojim se ubijaju Palestinci u Gazi.
The anger many Arab Americans feel toward their government is raw, and here in Michigan, it could make a difference. Joe Biden won this state by 150,000 votes in 2020. There are 200,000 Arab Americans in Michigan.
Od vodećih govornika do najmlađih, arapski Amerikanci izrazili su ogorčenost zbog rata u Gazi i podrške koju mu pruža američka vlada.
Ministarstvo zdravstva u Gazi objavilo je imena 34.344 Palestinca koji su ubijeni u izraelskim napadima. Uz ime navodi se i njihov spol, dob te lični identifikacijski broj. Na popisu se nalazi još 7.613 osoba čija su tijela primljena u bolnice i mrtvačnice, ali čiji identitet još nije potvrđen. Ukupan broj ubijenih u Gazi premašuje 41.000. Među identificiranim žrtvama je 169 beba koje su rođene nakon 7. oktobra i muškarac rođen 1922. koji je preživio više od stoljeća ratova. Dokument ima 649 stranica, a ubijeni su uglavnom navedeni po godinama. Više od 100 stranica popunjeno je imenima žrtava mlađih od 10 godina, a prva imena odraslih pojavljuju se tek na 215. stranici. Većina sa spiska se može identificirati kao civili na osnovu dobi i spola. Na popisu je više od 11.000 djece, blizu 3.000 osoba u dobi od 60 i više godina, te više od 6.000 žena. I među vojno sposobnim muškarcima je mnogo civila. Procjenjuje se da je gotovo još 10.000 osoba ubijenih u zračnim napadima ostalo zakopano u srušenim zgradama. Imena im nisu na spisku, a za njihovo izvlačenje nema dovoljno opreme i goriva. Izraelski dužnosnici dovode u pitanje broj ubijenih koji su objavile vlasti u Gazi. Međutim, evidencije iz Gaze i iz ranijih ratova su se pokazale tačnima, kažu predstavnici UN-a čiji su se popisi uglavnom podudarali s onima iz pojasa. Izrael tvrdi da je ubio 17.000 militanata, ali nikada nije objavio dokaze. Procjenu broja ubijenih civila Izrael ne objavljuje. Palestinska ekonomija na okupiranoj zapadnoj obali na rubu je kolapsa. S porastom nezaposlenosti pojedini radnici su se vratili poljoprivredi kako bi preživjeli. To je jedan od načina kako se Palestinci nose sa ekonomskim teškoćama i ograničenjima kojim je nametnuo Izrael, dok istovremeno štite svoju zemlju. Nur Odeh izvještava iz Beit Deđena, blizu Nablusa.
Zrele su i spremne za branje. Gajbe svježeg paradajza i povrća proizvedenog u Beit Deđenu idu na pijace širom okupirane zapadne obale. Do prije nekoliko mjeseci u ovom mjestu od 5.000 stanovnika nije se sadilo niti proizvodilo gotovo ništa. Većina mladih muškaraca radila je fizičke poslove u Izraelu. Onda je počeo rat u Gazi i svi su ostali bez posla. Umjesto da se predaju siromaštvu i očaju, desetine nezaposlenih muškaraca inspirisao je Muhammed Abu Tabet, koji je odlučio da uzgaja voće i povrće. Za nekoliko mjeseci uz Muhamedova 2 plastenika podignuto je još 200 drugih. Beit Deđen je oživio zahvaljujući ovim poljoprivrednim startupima. Stvorene su 100 novih radnih mjesta na branju, transportu i prodaji uroda. Otvorena je i prodavnica đubriva i drugih proizvoda. Koliko god bio profitabilan, uzgoj voća i povrća ovdje nije lak zadatak. Vode je malo, a izraelski doseljenici uništavaju plastenike na periferiji.
يعني سويت 10 دورمات ضد تساوي احنا 7 اخوي لو فيش عندنا المزرعه هاي 7 اخوي بنشحت يعني رسمي يعني اللي عنده معرض سكره عند اخوي معرض منفوشات فيش شغل
Niko se od sagovornika ne planira više vratiti na rad u Izrael. Uprkos rizicima, ponosni su na novostečenu slobodu.
Biddajan's story of revival has inspired others in neighboring towns. And this is what Palestinians say is the essence of their spirit, sumud, or resilience, planting hope where despair abounds. Nurode Al Jazeera, Biddajan, Palestine.
U Sarajevu je održan 7. festival dokumentarnog filma Al Jazeera Balkans, AJB Doc. Jedan od prikazanih i nagrađenih filmova je Cijena zemlje. Priča je to o radikalnom svijetu izraelskih doseljenika na palestinskoj zemlji, koja otkriva i izraelsku strategiju raseljavanja Palestinaca.
Otimanje palestinske zemlje i nasilje nad Palestincima na okupiranoj zapadnoj obali. Ovu priču na 7. AJB Doc donio je istraživački tim TRT Worlda. Obišli su doseljenička naselja, razgovarali s članovima ekstremističke organizacije Hilltop Youth, te istražili strategiju iza koje je jedan cilj – raseljavanje palestinskog naroda s njihove zemlje. Vođeni idejom da ta zemlja pripada Izraelcima, doseljenici, pomognuti izraelskom vojskom i ekstremističkim aktivistima, napadaju i protjeruju Palestince, uništavajući njihove domove i izvore života.
The way they speak, they feel very powerful. They are impune because as you can see in our documentary, and we have told that in any kind of any moment of our documentary, we said they want to kill or they want to occupy. They said those land is Israel land, Gaza Strip is Israel land. If they need to kill the Palestinians, they will.
Film prati i Danielu Weiss, jednu od najistaknutijih čelnica ekstremno desnog cionističkog pokreta ilegalnih doseljenika. Ekipa koja je nekoliko dana snimala na okupiranoj zapadnoj obali kaže da je morala poduzeti mjere opreza.
It was dangerous process. They thought that they were supporting their cause. So at the same time, they were filming with the Israeli activists, and these people see those activists traitors. So if these settlers knew that they were also filming with the others, I mean, it would have been really, really big problem. And at the end, actually, then it became they saw it at some point, and then they revealed it in their own newspaper. So. Then they had to leave Israel because their security was under threat.
Važno je da što više ljudi pogleda ovaj film, nepodijeljeno je mišljenje posjetilaca AJB Doca.
Film je prilično potresan i govori nam o onim stvarima o kojima smo i mogli dosad gledati na televiziji, na internetu. Tu su neki detalji koje sam prvi put vidio, način na koji se zemlja otima, način na koji doseljenici napadaju lokalno stanovništvo, Palestince.
Film Cijena zemlje je apsolutno šokantan jer prikazuje stvari koje mi ne vidimo tokom ovih uobičajenih tragičnih prizora dok traje genocid u Gazi i sniman je 2 mjeseca od početka svih tih dešavanja, u decembru prošle godine, gdje mi zapravo dobivamo jedan potpuno brutalan, čist, bez ikakve, kako bi se u komunikacijskom smislu reklo, buke u kanalu, nepatvoreni dokaz o sistemskoj politici, o odsustvu svake empatije, o potpunoj dehumanizaciji palestinskog naroda.
Autori filma kažu da nije bilo mnogo reakcija iz Izraela, ali da očekuju i glasniji odgovor doseljenika i njihovih pristalica. Istovremeno na terenu, na okupiranoj zapadnoj obali sve češće su izraelske racije, a nastavlja se i širenje nelegalnih izraelskih naselja, uprkos sve glasnijim međunarodnim osudama. Kerim Sefer, Al Jazeera, Sarajevo.
Institut za arapsku i islamsku umjetnost u Njujorku, koji se smatra mostom između istoka i zapada, domaćin je izložbe dijela američkog umjetnika libanskog porijekla Nabila Kanza. Izložbu Beskrajna noć čine dijela nastala u prošlom stoljeću, ali su njihove teme relevantne i danas.
Trenutna izložba u Njujorskom institutu za arapsku i islamsku umjetnost pomalo je uznemirujuća. Slike su upečatljive.
However you position
this painting, you will always see a figure that's upside down or in continuous movement.
Kompozicija je potpuno neobičajena.
Although it's very unsettling, I think it really has a remarkable, subtle message.
Delo je libanskog umetnika Nabila Kanza, koji je koristio neoekspresionistički stil kako bi prikazao užase rata i posljedice za nevine civile.
Nabil Kanza was born in Beirut, Lebanon in 1940, but came here to New York University to study in the late 1960s, at a time when campus protests against the Vietnam War were spreading across the nation, not unlike the Gaza protests we've seen in the last year. For Kanza, confronting war became an integral theme of his work.
Njegova serija crteža tušem, poznata kao Lišće sa bojnog polja, inspirisana je njegovim povratkom u Liban 1980-ih, na vrhuncu građanskog rata u toj zemlji. Kustos izložbe kaže da su apokaliptične vizije u njima namerne.
It was very important for him to depict scenes of war and conflict in his work, so that people understand and comprehend the impact that war has on our shared humanity, and that no matter how far or foreign a conflict is, one cannot be fully removed from the consequences of conflict on our human conscience.
Izložba Beskrajna noć i njena poruka su, nažalost, relevantne i u 21. veku.
Toliko u ovo sedmičnoj emisiji. Naredna je za 7 dana. Doviđenja.